Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are jumping straight into the pharmacology of overactive bladder, OEB.
Yep.
Our mission, drawing right from a core pharmacotherapeutics chapter, is basically to give you, the advanced practice learner, a really solid structured guide. We're talking drug classes, mechanisms, the clinical stuff you absolutely need to know.
And it's so important because OAB is, well, it's incredibly common. Affects maybe 16–17% of adults in the U.S.
Wow, that high.
Yeah, but it's often underreported. People feel embarrassed. And remember, OAB itself isn't a diagnosis. It's a symptom syndrome.
Right, based on symptoms, like
Wait,
urgency.
Exactly. Urinary urgency is the main one. Usually comes with frequency that's needing to go 8 or more times in 24 hours.
Right.
And nocturia, so waking up twice or more at night to pee, sometimes with urge incontinence, sometimes without.
So, okay, before we even think about drugs, we need to get the mechanics right. What's actually happening? What's the pathophysiology making that bladder muscle, the detrusor, misbehave?
Right. The whole urination cycle, the micturition cycle, it really depends on this complex interplay between the CNS, the PNS, and the lower urinary tract itself.
Okay.
But the key for us, pharmacologically speaking, is acetylcholine.
Ah, the neurotransmitter.
Exactly. ACylCo activates muscarinic receptors, M receptors, and that drives the bladder contraction. And specifically, it's the M3 subtype. That's the main switch controlling that detrusor muscle. So yeah, that M3 receptor, that's going to be our primary drug target, initially at least.
Okay, M3 is the target. But if that's the case, where do we actually start the treatment process? I hear it's not always with medication.
Absolutely critical point. The AUA 2019 guidelines are very clear. First line is always behavioral therapy.
Always?
Always start there. We're talking bladder training, setting schedules for voiding, pelvic floor exercises, Kegels.
Okay.
And maybe weight loss if that's a factor. Now, drugs are often used with these, but the behavioral stuff, that's the foundation.
And success isn't just stopping leaks, right?
Yeah.
The chapter emphasizes it's broader than that.
Totally. It's about resolving the symptoms, the urgency frequency, getting up at night, but maybe even more vital is helping the patient get back to their normal social life. OAB can be really isolating.
Makes sense.
And when you're assessing someone, you've also got to look for things that might be triggering or worsening the OAB. Think of them as like box 30.1 factors from the chapter.
Okay, like what sort of things?
Oh, it's a wide range. Neurologic conditions, MS, stroke, diabetic neuropathy, systemic diseases like diabetes itself, or heart failure, even psychological things like depression. And definitely check their med list diuretics, calcium channel blockers, sometimes even other anticholinergic drugs they're taking for something else can paradoxically make OAB worse.
Right, okay, that gives a much fuller picture.
Yeah.
Now, since OAB is so much about what the patient feels, how do we track progress? Is there a good objective tool?
Yeah, the best one really is the bladder diary, or sometimes called a voiding diary.
Okay, what's that involve?
It's basically a log the patient keeps for, say, 3 or maybe 7 days. They track everything, what fluids they drink, when they go, how much they void, and, importantly, how urgent it felt each time.
Patient reported.
Exactly. And that patient-generated log, it actually has the highest level of clinical evidence for really nailing down the symptoms and seeing if our treatment is working.
All right, let's get into the main pharmacologic players. The anticholinergic or antimuscarinic drugs, still the cornerstone, right?
Correct. They are still the mainstay. Their job is basically to block those muscarinic receptors. We talked about M3 mainly, a bit of M1 too, right there in the bladder.
And blocking them does what, functionally?
2 main things. 1, it helps the bladder hold more, increases its capacity. 2, it calms down those unwanted detrusor contractions, makes them less intense, less frequent.
So it delays that sudden urge.
Exactly. Delays that initial, often disruptive urge to void.
Now, this is where it gets a bit more detailed, especially for advanced practice. The chapter talks about tertiary versus quaternary amines. Why is that chemical difference such a big deal clinically, particularly thinking about older patients?
Yeah, it's all about the chemistry and the blood-brain barrier. Tertiary amines, think oxybutynin, tolterodine, sulfonisin.
The common ones.
Right. They are highly lipophilic, meaning they love fat, they're small, uncharged, they slip right across the blood-brain barrier very easily.
And the consequences.
A much higher risk of CNS side effects. We're talking cognitive fuzziness, confusion, even delirium, especially in the elderly. It's a major concern.
Okay, so if tertiary amines are risky for the brain, there's an alternative structural class.
Yes. The outlier is the quaternary amine, which is trospium, brand name Sanctura.
And trospium is different how?
Because it's a quaternary ammonium compound, it's much less lipophilic, it's not absorbed as well systemically, and crucially, it has a very limited ability to get into the brain.
Ah, so fewer CNS effects.
Significantly reduced likelihood of those cognitive side effects. That makes it a generally preferred option for older adults who are at risk.
Let's zero in on oxybutynin for a sec. It's been around forever, but it kind of has a bad rap for side effects, doesn't it?
It really does. It's sort of the classic example, highly lipophilic, like we said, but also it goes through a huge first-pass metabolism in the liver.
Okay.
And that creates this active metabolite, N-dysmethyl-oxybutynin. This metabolite works, but it's also responsible for most of the really bothersome anticholinergic side effects.
Like the classic dry mouth.
Exactly. Xerostomia, dry mouth is the big one. We could be looking at up to 70% of patients on immediate release oxybutynin getting significant dry mouth.
70%. Wow. No wonder people stop taking it.
It's the single most common reason for discontinuation, which, as you mentioned, leads to terrible adherence rates for this whole class.
So think about that case study too. Patient AD who had intolerable dry mouth on tolterodine LA. That's pretty typical.
Absolutely typical real-world problem. A patient like AD comes in, the tolterodine is maybe helping the bladder, but the dry mouth is just too much.
What do you do?
Well, you can try conservative stuff, sip water, sugar-free gum, or candy. But often, the better solution is either changing how the drug is delivered or switching to a different drug class altogether.
Which explains the development of things like the patch, oxytrol, or the extended release forms like ditropan XL.
Precisely. The patch, for instance, delivers the drug steadily through the skin, bypassing that heavy first-pass liver metabolism. It causes significantly less dry mouth compared to even ER tolterodine.
Interesting. So how do oxybutynin and tolterodine stack up head-to-head?
Generally, tolterodine causes fewer people to quit because of side effects overall. But if you look strictly at how well they reduce urination frequency, ER oxybutynin is actually significantly more effective than ER tolterodine.
So it's a trade-off. Efficacy versus tolerability.
Always a balancing act with these drugs.
Any other key players in this class? What about fesoterodine?
Fesoterodine, brand name Tovia's, is worth knowing. It's a prodrug.
Meaning it needs to be converted in the body.
Right. It gets converted to the active form, 5-HMT. The neat thing is, this conversion doesn't rely on the CYP2D6 enzyme pathway in the liver.
Why is that good?
It means less potential for pharmacokinetic variability between patients and fewer drug interactions, especially important for people on multiple meds.
Good point. Before we leave anticholinergics, quick review. Absolute contraindication.
Okay, main ones. Because they relax the bladder, you absolutely avoid them if someone already has urinary retention.
Makes sense.
And because they can increase pressure inside the eye, they're contraindicated in narrow-angle glaucoma.
Got it. And dose adjustments. Renal issues.
Yes, definitely need to watch kidney function. Tolterodine, trospium, celifenicin, fesoterodine, they all need dose reductions if the CRCL, creatinine clearance, drops below 30 mmol.
Okay.
And specifically, the extended-release trospium, ER trospium, should be avoided entirely in those patients with severe renal impairment. That's highlighted in Table 30.6 in the chapter.
Okay, that's a lot on the M3 blockers. But what if we could tackle OAB from a totally different angle? This brings us to Mirabegron, right? The newer option.
Mirabegron, brand name Mirabegron, yes. This was really the first novel compound, a real game changer, because it works completely outside the muscarinic system.
So how does it work then?
Its mechanism is totally different. It's a selective beta-3 adrenal receptor agonist.
Beta-3?
Yeah.
Okay, what does activating that receptor do?
Instead of blocking contraction, activating beta-3 receptors actually promotes relaxation of the detrusor muscle, specifically during the bladder's filling phase.
Ah, so it helps the bladder relax and hold more.
Exactly. Increases capacity, reduces frequency. And the huge clinical advantage is it does this without causing those typical anticholinergic side effects.
No dry mouth. No constipation.
Generally, no. And crucially, no cognitive impairment risk.
That sounds like a major win, especially for older patients we were just talking about. How does the efficacy compare to the anticholinergics?
Pretty similar efficacy, actually. Head-to-head, it works about as well, but with that dramatically better side effect profile.
Much more tolerable.
Much more. So for older adults or anyone sensitive to anticholinergic effects, Mirabegron is often a really strong choice, maybe even first-line pharmacologic choice after behavioral therapy.
What about dosing or cautions with Mirabegron?
Standard dose starts at 25 milligrams once daily, can go up to 50 milligrams. It's generally well tolerated, but it's recommended to monitor blood pressure as some increases were seen in studies.
Okay.
Also, there's been some observation of dose-related QT prolongation on ECGs, but mostly at really high supertherapeutic doses, like 200 milligrams.
And kidney or liver issues.
Yes, dose adjustment needed there too. For severe renal impairment or moderate hepatic impairment, the max dose should be kept at 25 milligram daily.
Right, so we have behavioral therapy first, then anticholinergics or Mirabegron. What if those first-line pharmacologic options fail? What's next?
Then you're moving into second or third line territory. The main player there is onabotulinum toxinae.
Botox for the bladder.
Yep, Botox injections directly into the detrusor muscle. This is reserved for refractory cases, meaning someone's failed at least 2 of those first-line drugs.
How does Botox work in the bladder?
It blocks the release of acetylcholine, that neurotransmitter we keep talking about, right at the nerve endings in the muscle. It basically causes a temporary localized paralysis of the muscle.
Flaccid paralysis. Sounds intense. How long does it last?
The effect usually lasts about 6 to 9 months, then it typically needs to be repeated.
Now, injecting Botox, that sounds like it could have some serious downsides.
It definitely does. The big one is the risk of urinary retention.
The bladder becomes too relaxed.
Exactly. It can't empty properly. This happens in a significant minority, maybe 6 to 17% of patients.
So what happens then?
This is the absolute critical caveat you have to discuss with the patient beforehand. A non-negotiable condition for getting Botox treatment is that the patient must be willing and able to perform self-catheterization if retention occurs.
Wow, okay. That's a major commitment.
It is. And there's also a black box warning about the potential, though rare, for the toxin to spread beyond the injection site. That could cause systemic effects like muscle weakness, vision problems, difficulty swallowing, or even breathing problems. Serious stuff.
Definitely third line for a reason.
Okay.
What other options are mentioned for difficult cases? SNRIs.
Yes, drugs like duloxetine or venlafaxine can sometimes be used. Their mechanism involves boosting serotonin and norepinephrine, which seems to enhance the urethral sphincter's activity.
So, more helpful for stress incontinence.
It seems to have more documented success for stress urinary incontinence, SUI, yeah. But since OAB often involves urge incontinence, UUI, and sometimes mixed pictures, it can play a role. Just remember the big contraindication. Never use SNRIs with MAO inhibitors.
Right. And what about alpha blockers like tamsulosin?
Those are primarily for men who have OAB symptoms because of bladder outlet obstruction, usually from an enlarged prostate, BPH.
Okay, specific population.
Yeah. Tamsulosin works by blocking alpha-1 receptors in the prostate and bladder neck, relaxing the muscle there and making it easier to void. Main side effect to watch for is postural hypotension, dizziness when standing up.
And one more. Topical estrogens.
Right. For postmenopausal women where urogenital atrophy might be contributing to their OAB or incontinence symptoms.
Atrophy due to low estrogen.
Exactly. Using topical estrogen, like Vagifem cream or an estering ring, delivers estrogen locally to help restore tissue tone and elasticity down there.
And it has to be topical.
Absolutely critical distinction. Systemic estrogen, like pills or patches, is not recommended for incontinence and can actually make it worse. Stick to topical for this indication.
Okay, wow. Lots of options. Let's try to tie this together strategically for the advanced practice student listening. How does the AUA recommend sequencing these?
The AUA algorithm provides a clear pathway. Step 1, behavioral therapy, always.
Always first.
Then, if meds are needed, start with an extended release anticholinergic. Interestingly, the guidelines don't prefer one specific anticholinergic over another to start.
Okay.
Now, if that first drug fails, or the patient can't tolerate it, like our case study AB with the dry mouth,
Right.
then the next step is either switch to a different ER anticholinergic, maybe one with a better side effect profile like trospium, or switch class entirely to Mirabegron.
So you try another first-line agent before moving on.
Correct. You only escalate to third-line options like Botox after the patient has tried and failed at least 2 different first-line pharmacologic agents.
This really brings us back to the challenge with older adults, doesn't it? Highest prevalence of OAB, but also highest risk from the main drug class.
It's the central clinical dilemma. You have to individualize. Knowing the CNS risks of tertiary amines, you should strongly lean towards agents with lower CNS penetration trospium, maybe darafenicin, or ideally consider Mirabegron right off the bat for many older patients because it avoids those cognitive risks.
So the clinician needs to be proactive in that initial ER anticholinergic choice, even if the guidelines say no preference.
I think so. You need to consider the patient in front of you, especially their age and cognitive baseline, and choose the molecular structure that's likely safest for them.
And one last practical point monitoring.
Hmm.
How do we really know if the treatment is working, especially since OAB symptoms can fluctuate?
It really comes back to the patient's experience. Since OAB is defined by subjective symptoms, success is primarily measured by patient feedback on those symptoms. Urgency, frequency, nocturia, incontinence episodes, and their overall quality of life.
So listen to the patient.
Absolutely. We also use validated questionnaires in practice and clinical trials. Things like the OABQ Overactive Bladder Questionnaire or the ISI Incontinence Severity Index to get a more standardized measure of improvement.
This has been a fantastic deep dive. We've covered the landscape from behavioral strategies through the M3 blocking anticholinergics, the pros and cons there, and onto the newer beta-3 agonist approach with Mirabegron, plus the third-line options.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway is really understanding those two main pharmacologic targets, M3 antagonism and beta-3 agonism, and then tailoring the therapy. You have to weigh efficacy against the very real risks, especially those anticholinergic side effects, for each individual patient.
That individualized strategy really is crucial for advanced practice.
It absolutely is.
So looking ahead, what's a final thought for our learners to chew on?
Well, we talked about those really dismal adherence rates for antimuscarinics, right?
Yeah.
Like 5 to 9% still taking them after a year.
Shockingly low.
So here's the question. Given the much better tolerability we see with newer agents like Mirabegron, how might the growing use of these novel, better-tolerated drug classes actually start to fundamentally change OAB management? Could we finally see better long-term adherence and maybe better outcomes in the coming years?
Shifting the standard of care through better tolerability. That's a powerful thought to consider.
Something for you all to think about as you move into practice.
Excellent. Thank you so much for breaking down this complex pharmacology for us today. And thank you, our listeners, for joining us on the deep dive. Hopefully this structured approach helps you master OAB pharmacotherapy. We'll catch you on the next dive.